the troops began to move in the opposite direction to attack the enemy on the St. Lo line. And we were passing through the city of Valognes, and of course it was completely destroyed. I was there several times since the war, and it's been rebuilt beautifully. But the Germans tried to make a stand here, and wherever they did try to make a stand, we had to knock them out, and in so doing, destroyed the city. A little later on, I had an opportunity to see the construction that was built by slave labor. And all along the beach, especially in the Normandy area as well as other areas, they built these triangles. Many of them had mines attached to them so that if a boat touched them, they would explode. And I was told after taking this walk that I should be very careful not to step where the ground is soft. This is a church in Barfleur. That was a pretty little town that the Germans evacuated because the commander liked the city so much, the little town so much, that he didn't want to see it destroyed, and just actually withdrew rather than let it be destroyed. It was a little fishing village, and I had the good fortune of coming back several times because the hotel was still intact and serving very excellent French food. A little further down the coast, we found these fortifications built by slave labor, and even these metal fences just to keep us from landing in the area. And these heavy fortifications that were many feet thick, and these correspondents were looking it over. In some areas, the Germans saw to it that they were destroyed, blowing them up so that we couldn't use them against them if they tried to take them back. They even destroyed their own weapons. But we noticed that the walls and fortifications were very thick and very strong. The area was taken over by the Navy, and there was an observation post right on the end. This was near a town called Granville, and there is the lighthouse at the point that sort of separated Normandy from Brittany. And that's the observation post the Germans used, and it's under the command of our naval officers to use as an observation post. Soon we brought in some of our big armament, and they were set up in a field and firing at German positions. But even though the guns were firing, the French people were bringing in the crops as though nothing was happening. This surprised me, and I couldn't help but wanting to make a picture of it. Of course, these heavy guns caused terrific concussion, and it was difficult to hold a handheld camera that long. One of the first things that the Americans did was to build an airstrip in the St. Mary Glees area, not far from the coast. And they used a strip that was supported by metal wire to keep the planes from sinking into the ground. And they were using it also as a place to take off from with 500-pound bombs under each wing. But the strip was so rough that frequently the bombs would break loose, and even though they were armed, they had to be disarmed and taken off the runway. These are P-47s that they were using here, and there's one carrying a bomb under each wing to attack the enemy deep in behind the lines. You notice these two planes taking off at once, raising considerable dust, but managing to get off a very short runway. And here you notice a plane, you notice the buckle under the wheels. This sometimes caused the mesh wire to break and come up and hit the plane's propeller, causing it to crash before it left the ground. And here's an unfortunate accident, two of our planes. Here we see some pictures made by automatic cameras that were installed in the fighter planes, because when a pilot reported that he had shot down an enemy plane, he wasn't given credit unless his pictures proved that the plane was shot down. And these automatic cameras would operate in conjunction with his machine guns. And if you look closely, you'll see the pilot jump out of the plane in the shot. But you notice, too, that a lot of these planes are still carrying the extra fuel tanks that they were carrying underneath the wing. And whenever the bullets hit that tank, the plane would explode, as you will see here. But when you saw shots like this, you know that the pilot never got back. And one of the highlights of our trip across France was Mont St. Michel. Mont St. Michel was on a river that separated Normandy from Brittany. And here we met some of the other correspondents. This is Bob Capa of Time magazine, and I know there's a member in the audience who knew Bob Capa. And Bob Capa was eventually killed. He was covering the war in Indochina when the French was fighting. But at Mont St. Michel, we found the Poulade Hotel run by Madame Poulade. And the reason we liked the place is she served some delicious omelets for which she was famous. And that's Madame Poulade and her famous hotel in the background. And a lot of the correspondents gathered here to fight the war from this point because we were closer to the front line, if you could call it such, than we were at our main bases. And there we see the river that separates Normandy from Brittany. This is a beautiful little island, and the building at the top is a monastery that was still intact. It was not destroyed at all. And here are some of our GIs looking over the sites of the monastery, being shown around by a woman guide. Soon we met some of the other correspondents we knew, and here we see Charles Collingwood, the gentleman on the right, with Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News, and Joe Liebling of New Yorker magazine, the bald-headed chap, and Wertenbecker on the extreme left. Liebling wrote many stories for New Yorker magazine, and he died not many years ago. This is Charles Collingwood and Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News. This is Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was covering for Collier's magazine, and we met him at Mont St. Michel. Here he is seen talking with Bill Walton, who incidentally became a fast friend of President Kennedy. And these were just moments that we could take a little time out to rest. There's Helen Kirkpatrick, and the man in the center in this picture is Bill Stringer, and he was killed trying to get into Paris. One of the things that correspondents tried to do was to get into Paris before anyone else, and he was hit by an 88 shell. But this is just a moment of relaxation. We had a few, and of course, these are the shots I wanted to bring home to the family and friends. But the little island was very quaint, and it was a very old place, but it was fortified in several ways. We discovered that the beaches in the area, especially when the tide was out, would be high and dry, and they put those sticks in the sand to keep our planes from landing. We found a little family of 3 brothers, and even the tall blonde one was a boy, I found out later, because their grandmother was taking care of them. Their parents, I was told, were killed at the Battle of St. Lo. One afternoon, rather late, I walked out behind the island because as the sun was setting, I could get some interesting shots of the island from the seaside, because they have an extremely high tide here and would leave the island high and dry, but the tide would come in real fast, and there was always danger of quicksand, so I didn't stand in one place too long. But the receding waters left this unusual design in the sand. We didn't stay at Mont St. Michel very long, but continued on deeper into France. In fact, I went into Brittany for a while and discovered that the boys had found a lake there, which we'll see in a moment. But the countryside was beautiful. It was during the summer, and the crops were still in the field. But our boys, after washing out of a helmet for many weeks, decided to use this beautiful lake for a bath. They were permitted to do so because they were fighting the enemy at an area called St. Malo. And incidentally, you probably recall the Germans held out at St. Malo for many months, almost to the end of the war. And, of course, it's the American sense of humor that helped them win the war, too. But here are some of the correspondents that we sometimes travel together, and we found a little river that proved to be useful as a bath. There are a lot of these small rivers around France, and at every moment that we could spare, the correspondents, this is a group of them, that's Ralph Morse in the front, and Huey Broderick, and Joe Priestley, and of course here we see Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was one of the many actors and actresses that came to Normandy to entertain our troops, and they held a show right in this Normandy barn that was not too far from the fighting. And I found out later that the intermission had to be called when the shells came too close. Of course, all you had to do was point a camera at Robinson, and he acted. Soon we found ourselves in Rambouillet. Rambouillet was 52 kilometers from Paris and was the headquarters for all the correspondents that came there. We see Ernie Pyle again on the left, and George Stevens, the Hollywood director, myself, and of course Pete Carroll. It was shortly after these pictures were taken that Ernie Pyle decided to return back to the States and then went to the Pacific, where he was killed. George Stevens was a very well-known Hollywood director, I'm sure you recall, and he died only a few years ago. But practically every correspondent turned out to try to get into the city of Paris. But we found, as I said earlier, that the General Eisenhower had given permission to the 2nd French Armor Division to take the city of Paris, because the important thing was to destroy the enemy, and they didn't consider Paris as a target. It would delay them if they did try to take the city themselves. They wanted to circumvent the city because they wanted to give the honor to the French. General Leclerc was in command of the 2nd Armor Division, and he refused to let the correspondents accompany his force to get into the city, simply because he didn't want any shots made until he had the city secure.